Please, enough. No, more.
Today's topic is Identity Access Management, or IAM. Mike, what have you heard enough about with IAM, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
IAM is one of those that's been around for so long. I mean, it might even be one of the original security controls. You know, you could argue that passwords way back in the day was like the first iteration of identity and access management. And yet we're still having this discussion, and we still haven't really got to a good place on it. The specifics around the things that I really have heard enough about is there's always been this approach of centralized gates, and that's fine for like the identity side. You know, there's a single source of identity makes sense, but for the access management, the authorization piece, the idea that you go to the security team and they decide if you should have access to something, that doesn't scale. So the centralized gates is one of the areas that I've heard enough of. So many IAM systems, it's a manual effort to keep them up to date. You know, you've got someone who's going into an interface and clicking and dragging people around, and that also doesn't scale. But the third thing that I'd say that I've heard enough of is that Active Directory is the best IAM, or whatever solutions that you have are going to tie to Active Directory, because you're seeing more and more companies who don't have Active Directory. And so many of the good solutions out there for IAM are expecting Active Directory, which means that a lot of people just can't use it. So those are some of the things I've heard enough about.
And what would you like to hear a lot more?
Scalability, automation, like federated decision-making is a great concept where you can distribute who can decide who does and doesn't have access. And the last thing I would like to see is a time element, that you're granted access for a period of time and then it's revoked.
Now, wouldn't that also go into privileged access management? I know there's kind of a fine line explaining the two, but yes, wouldn't that fall into that category?
It's a feature that you can use for both concepts, yes.
All right, let's now throw this over to you, Brian. I'm going to ask you the same exact question. What have you heard enough about in identity access management, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
Two-factor authentication is going to save us all on the identity access management of what I've heard enough of. That, you know, we need to find better and more interesting ways and innovative ways to gain access. And I think that what I'm not hearing enough of is understanding that identity access management is going to be and is insanely different in the cloud than it is in an on-premise world. In our cloud environments, identities aren't just people. They are Lambda functions, they are databases, they are servers, they are all sorts of things. Each one of those assets has its own identity, its own set of permissions that's been associated to it. You've literally taken what was already a very complicated problem and you've 10x'd it at least. And so, you know, what we need to be focusing on is how do we think about identity less about people and less about authentication systems that deal with people, and more about how do we deal with identity from a perspective of assets and resources and automation. As Mike already mentioned, how do we deal with identity through things like behavioral analytics and leveraging AI and automation to determine what should and shouldn't have access to what things at what time. And it's the only way we're going to scale this environment as we move forward.
And scalability being a critical thing, which is one of the things Mike would like to know about. And I'm assuming this is what DivvyCloud does. Can you sort of explain?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a problem that's facing cloud holistically, not just IAM, but it's definitely hugely prevalent in IAM. It is the number of resources you have. It is the number of people touching it. And it is the number of changes that are occurring. All three of those things have dramatically increased in cloud versus when we were doing data center. And so as a security person, you're stuck trying to track 10,000 targets that are moving very, very quickly and change on you all the time throughout the day. And we're trying to use old methods to manage that problem, run books. And, you know, as Mike pointed out, people drag and dropping, you know, what can have access to what. It's just not sustainable because operating at that scale, you can't possibly wrap your head around it. So we need to leverage things like behavioral analytics to understand, you know, that Mary, who has access to these resources over here, all of a sudden randomly starts accessing these things because she has too broad permissions to handle it. And now we need to react to that situation in real time using some behavioral analytics to determine that, hey, maybe that's a privilege escalation issue. Like, those are the things that we have to start doing. Leveraging automation to drive least privilege access. identifying the roles and policies that exist inside these environments that are too permissive and automatically whittling them down by identifying what that user does and does not actually do over a 30-day period of time. Those are the type of automations we need to leverage because, unfortunately, if you don't use automation, you have to fall back to a deny by default approach. And that takes all of the wind out of the sails of why you moved to cloud in the first place. And that was innovation. And we're right back to where we started with old school IT. And let's not forget, when people moved to cloud and moved these systems to get away from the slow, dogged nature of old school IT, we're not bringing that back. It's not happening. So we've got to find a way to leverage automation to make ourselves safer, more secure in this much fast-paced moving world.
So let me just ask one follow-up on that is, what are the environments that your clients are in right now where essentially they're trying to do like what we talked about earlier, trying to balance that innovation security situation physically in the cloud? I mean, you spelled out a very clear picture for us. Can you whittle it down to maybe just one example? I mean, you sort of gave me a scenario of Mary accessing something you shouldn't, but maybe kind of a real world example you saw?
Yeah, sure. So this is an interesting one. The clouds have been fighting a battle to separate each other from one another, right? They have two goals. They want to separate themselves, differentiate, and then they also want to pigeonhole you into their cloud. Amazon wants you to use Lambda and only Lambda, and that's the future of the world. So in order to do that, sometimes the providers or other people create frameworks for making cloud easier to use. Well, in order to do that, what they do is they make some wildly massive assumptions. I'll give you an example. There's a couple of serverless frameworks out there that make it easy to deploy a Lambda function into Amazon and immediately have an API endpoint open and available to the world that has access to an S3 bucket or whatever it might be. And the way that they do that is the framework doesn't know what your security policies are inside your organization. It doesn't know how it can do the things it needs to do to lock it down. So as opposed to creating any friction where the developer has to learn about identity access management in cloud, they just make the Lambda function permissive and grant it permission to everything. And so what happens is it's very quick for the engineer to be able to deploy a Lambda method. But it's very hard for them to understand what that Lambda method has access to. And by the way, as it turns out, the framework made it by default so they could access basically everything. And those are the types of behaviors that we need to sort of use education to curtail.